without further ado, in the interests of keeping us to time, it's my great pleasure and it's our great honor actually to have Professor Rae Cooper join us. Professor Cooper is a gender work and employment relations professor at the University of Sydney Business School and the founding director of the Australian Centre for Gender Equality and Inclusion at Work. She's the leading researcher on the world of work, having researched and published scores of articles across many aspects of women's working lives, including respect and equality at work, career navigation, working life in very predominantly male-dominated sectors, and presently her key projects examine sexual harassment in the retail industry. So we're super excited to hear more about the most recent piece of research that Professor Cooper brings to the world. Over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for that lovely introduction. I noted that you said I was the researcher on the world of work. I'd like to say I am, but I definitely am not. I'm a researcher. So I might have to get you to unshare so I can share. Does that work?
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So great to be here, and thank you so much for having me along, and thank you so much for the work that Our Watch does. I keep up with your seminars and materials and have chats regularly with colleagues in your network. So thank you so much for your leadership and your support. And also hello to everyone who's here. But this has got my name on it because only my name on it, because one of my team did it because I'm presenting. But I have to say, I'm not really one to present something to pretend it's all my own work. There's a very big team who worked with me on this project, and mine's only one of the names on the front page of this most excellent report. I've got a QR code that's coming up that you can link you to the report, and I'll also will list the names of the people who worked with me on the project as well. And what else did I want to say? I also, before I even start, I want to say this is an ANROS report, and we were very happy to receive an ANROS grant under the Respect at Work grants that ANROS funded. And I've got to say, the ANROS team were absolutely amazing to work with from the beginning of the project through project management all the way to when we did a press release and a press conference almost 2 weeks ago to get the word out. We just got a media report on the day that we released the report, and it's told us that the audience share was about 14 million people. So that's in large part due to the really great work that the ANROS colleagues did with us. So I wanted to acknowledge that they've been working with us, and their ANROS is on the front page as well as my name and the rest of the team I've worked with. I also wanted to acknowledge country. I'm on Gadigal land, beautiful Gadigal land, and I want to acknowledge elders past and present, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal people who are with us today, and acknowledge continuing custodianship of the land. Okay. All right. So I said to you before that I was going to just note that you could access the report through that you can get it through that QR code there. I think I'll also pop it in the chat later on, just the link to the ANROS site where you can download the report if you're interested. And also just to note there that my co-authors, I thought I might forget them if I said it on the front page. So it's myself, Professor Liz Hill, Dr. Sneha Cedarhull, Dr. Mariah Foley, Marnie Harris, Charlie Hock, and Amy Tapsell were all very important in writing this report. We all did different bits and pieces of the work. Again, just to acknowledge ANROS and all of the great staff there who helped us all the way through the project. I'll assume everyone who wants to QR code is QR coded. All right, so I'm just going to talk. This is a very big report, and it took us a year to do. And I'm going to try to just narrow it down a little bit from the report, which you can have a look at yourself, and feel free to talk to us if you have any particular questions about the findings, methods, or focus. So I'm just going to really talk through these things, and I wanted to just point out that I'm mostly going to be talking about the focus groups, which are 6 there, and we have a 3-step method, which I'll talk about in a tick, and talk about some of the highlights from those focus groups. I've got to say, highlights is not really the right word because a lot of it is pretty disturbing stuff and quite depressing, and so they're not really highlights. They're like lots of lowlights, really. I don't know that that's the opposite of highlights, but let's just go with that. And then I just wanted to also note that I've got the detailed recommendations from the report are in the back of the slides. I probably won't get to that, Mike, but I thought it might be worth just setting them out in brief there, so that when we share the slides, that people have got them there in a more truncated version than in the report. And then also to note that any of the references that I cite here are in the are on the final 2 pages, so you can access those when the gang sends it around. Okay, so what's the approach that we take? This is a model that my team use across lots of different contexts, looking at how careers are gendered and how the experience of the labour market is gendered. And so we've used this kind of model in different contexts. It probably seems like a really strange thing to do, to say, okay, this is the model that we developed when we're trying to understand the gender dynamics of careers in investment management and try to apply that to retail. But it actually kind of works for us, because it both describes our method, but it also describes, I guess, the theoretical sort of underpinnings of what we're trying to do in the work that we're doing. And I'll just really briefly talk that through. So if you look at the big onion, the outside of the onion, through into the concentric circles there in the middle. What we're trying to say with this model is that we need to understand and centre people, and people are the coloured concentric circles there in the middle of the diagram, which is talking about who this particular groups are that we're talking about, what types of jobs they're working in, and what types of employment arrangements and contracts they're working on. And for us, they seem to be really critical things to understand about the experience of people, of humans in the workplace and in the labour market. So we try to centre them and try to centre the voices in most of the work that we do. So talking to humans and trying to talk about the meanings that they make about the experiences that they're having. We could then go back out to the outside part of the onion there. It's also really important to talk about not just the experience of people, but how it's embedded in different contexts, including institutional context, which includes a range of things such as the regulatory context in which behaviours, experiences are happening, who the big parties are and what their actions are. And for us, that might include, for example, in this particular space, the legislative context in which we're working, and that might include, for example, the new positive duty in relation to sexual harassment. We talk about industry and the ways in which industry has a real impact on what happens to those people and what their experiences are. So I can tell you very much that our analysis of what happens in investment management is really quite different to what happens in the retail sector. And there are really, we talk a lot about social norms as they exist in, broadly in society, particularly around gendered experiences and issues. But we see these kind of expressing themselves in particular ways in different industry contexts. And so what we're trying to capture are some of the norms that are really expressed in specific industry areas. And it won't surprise you to know that the issue of, the customer being king, or the customer is always right, or customer sovereignty really comes out very strongly in retail, as it does in many service sector contexts. Then there's the organisational context as well. And the organisation might include things such as the policies and the practices of particular organisations. It might include which segment of the industry a particular organisation sits within. And that can all shape what's going on in that particular scale that we're looking at. So that model kind of drives the way that we try to think about what drives the experiences of people. And it also is a way to try to situate what we're doing, but it also drives our method to a point. So we sort of have a number of steps to our method that try to capture all of those things. I can't talk about all of them, but that's a start. Okay. Can she move her slides along? Yes. Okay. I'm also trying to move, when you've got the people's faces, I'm trying to move people's faces so I can also see my big words. Okay, so basically we have a three-phase approach in this work, and that's all detailed in the report. The first step was analysis of 4 big data sets. The second was interviews with key informants, and the third was targeted focus groups. So I'm going to spend most of my time on 3. So the data sets that we looked at were the Human Rights Commission's Time for Respect report and their data, the collaborative piece that was done between the SDA, the Retail Union, and the Human Rights Commission in 2019. And then 3 and 4 are 2 surveys that were done by our team at the University of Sydney that include either a sample of retail workers, and you'll see if there's 2 numbers in a bracketed in brackets against one of those. The second number is retail workers, and the bigger number will be the total sample. So you can see that 2 of those surveys, number 2 and number 4, have only, number 2 and number 3 have only retail workers in them, but the others have smaller groups of retail workers. So we've used all of those to try to go, okay, what's the levels, and what are the hotspots, which is probably not the right word, but where are the particularly risky groups, at-risk groups, or at-risk or risky contexts in which people are working from those data sets. From that, we then sort of formed up interviews with industry key informants, and they tended to be people working in very senior roles in retail. They might have been people who were the person most responsible for dealing with sexual harassment policy in a large retail business. And there might be some of those people here in the audience today, and I wanted to acknowledge the time that they put in to help us to form up our thinking around this particular question. But it also included people from industry associations and also the Retail Union, who gave us some really good sort of high-level context about what's going on, what they see as the key problems, and helped us to try to work out what the focus might be of our questions in our focus groups. So together, 1 and 2 together helped us to come up with some propositions about how we should construct the sample for the focus groups with retail workers and retail managers. In the end, we did 12 online focus groups which had a mix of retail workers and managers. Most of them were not supervisors, but there was a decent share of supervisors. And we had anticipated that would work, having them all mixed together, but we worked out in the end that we wanted to get that voice of supervisors a little bit more foregrounded. So we ran 2 that were just with managers in the end. It was very hard to recruit them because they work really long hours, and there weren't a lot of managers that we pulled into those groups, but what they did give us was some really rich and nuanced data. Okay, so all those focus groups were targeted around different employment types. So if you go back to the model, they were sort of informed by those 3 concentric circles. So about the types of employment contracts people were working in, the type of workplace they were working in, and the groups and the identities of the workers. And we tended to try to get them as tightly as we could to being a common interest group. Now, I'm going to talk mostly about focus groups, as I said, but here's just a little bit of data on incidents. So pulling out, this is all retail data, and you'll notice that the 2022 Human Rights Commission data suggests very similar to the SDA Human Rights Commission's report, that somewhere between 41 and 44% of women working in retail, somewhere between 26 and 29% of men working in retail, and somewhere between 33 and 39% of all workers working in retail had an experience of sexual harassment in the past 5 years. Our survey, which is the one at the bottom there, the most recent one, suggests a lot lower incidence, but that I can explain that later if anyone's got any questions. That goes to the sample that we have. So it's not that ours shows half the incidence, it's that our sample includes very broadly defined retail workers, including warehousing, including fast food, and including people who work in services to retail. If I cut that by people who are in the ANSCO codes of cashier and sales assistant, they look almost exactly the same as the AHRC and the SDA's data. But the reason why we've had to use this particular data set at the bottom is that that's the only level at which we can get down to unit level, because it's our data, and we were able to do the statistical analysis on that on that data because we had that access rather than access basically to other people's tables. All right, I'm already getting behind, Mike. Okay, why are we interested in studying retail? So as an industrial relations professor, I've got to say there's been a lot of studies of a lot of industries over time, and I've got to say that retail is not foregrounded in many of those studies. I don't really know why that is, because retail is such an important industry across the global labour market and in Australia. Over 9% of all working Australians are employed in the retail sector, so it's a major employer. It is also a feminised sector, but not highly feminised, if you like. But the majority of workers who work in the industry are women. If we go down to some of the smaller ANSCO codes within retail, like cashier and sales assistant, they are much more feminised than the total. We know that women are really important around spending decisions and revenue in the retail industry, and there's been some estimates by the Australian Retailers Association, for example, that 3/4 of spending decisions are made by women. And something that's really important to understand about this workforce is that it's a really young workforce. That about 1/4 of all retail workers are aged in their teens. And if we put together hospitality and retail, that is basically the great majority of first entrants to the labour market. So it's got a very different mix of workers than many other sectors. There's also a very high preponderance of people on insecure contracts. They're very young, and there are a lot of people who are working in their first job. So all of that might actually give you a hint about why people don't study retail as much. And I think it's because it's seen as a low status industry, perhaps. People in my discipline will tend to go after the industries and look at those that they think are probably more interesting, maybe like mining and manufacturing and those kinds of areas. But for me, this is a really important industry and a really vital one to our economy that we need to be looking at. Okay, so I'm going to start talking to you about the findings. These are the key things that came out for us from the key informants, where we did interviews with 15 people who were basically the lead person in a particular organisation dealing with sexual harassment. These are the sorts of concerns that came out, and we particularly focused in on what are the big challenges that they're facing around addressing sexual harassment in the way that they thought would be effective. Often what came out was the age and experience of the workforce, that this is a new entrants workforce, a large segment of it, and that there's a lot of people who haven't been exposed to, and not exposed to concepts around sexual harassment, but have not been exposed to the workplace before, leading to lower levels of knowledge of policies. And also, because it's such a high turnover sector, quite some concern amongst this group of specialist managers that training was very hard to make sure that it had good coverage, because there's so much movement. So you could train at commencement and then, basically lose people after that, or that there were big challenges in maintaining repeated training sessions and reinforced training sessions over time. They talked to us a lot about the specific risks in key segments. And this particularly went to looking at issues around the nature of the product being sold. And for us, fashion retail come up as a really big risk area, and particularly some segments of fashion retail in clothing around issues in areas such as selling of intimate apparel, selling of exercise wear, and also in areas such as the selling of cosmetics and jewellery came out amongst this group as being an area where there's really significant concerns. They talked a lot to us about legislative responsibilities and the change to the positive duty and what that might mean for them. A lot of them talked to us about this is a feminised. Oh, that means I'm almost finished, Mike. I'm in big trouble because I haven't even got to the rest of the.
It's okay. It's okay. Keep working through.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I won't rush too much. I talk too fast as it is. And a lot of them talk to us about the gendered hierarchies in the industry, where, most organisations and industries look like this, with women distributed at the bottom and men at the top. A lot of people would sort of do this when they talked about retail, because it's much more hierarchical, more sort of pin-like than it is like a pyramid. And then a key theme that came out is customers. Customers are a very big problem and a large perpetrator group. And you can see there, I've put in that quote there, that represented basically what everyone in those focus groups told us was about the interactions between particularly very young women and often older men customers. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the focus groups and talking about what retail workers and supervisors told us about their understandings, their experiences of sexual harassment. Something that came out very strongly, and this is a little bit in contrast to what the key informants told us. Key informant interviewees told us that they felt that retail workers didn't understand what sexual harassment was. So one of the first questions that we asked them in these focus groups was, we talk a lot about sexual harassment. Can you just tell us what that means to you? What do you understand about it? And I almost could have had the act sitting in front of me in the way that these people talked about the sort of different types of behaviours, the physicality of some behaviours, the sort of the verbal nature of some behaviours, the vibe, the tone, all of, very, very detailed understanding of sexual harassment. So I think we can't necessarily assume that workers frontline in retail, the problem is their knowledge. I think they know it through having experienced it. Came out very strongly for us that young women were described across all of the focus groups, whether it was men or women, whether it was retail workers only or supervisors, talking about the high risk to young women. And if it wasn't young women talking about it, it was older women describing their previous experiences, or it was other colleagues talking about their observations of their colleagues in the workplace. So the title of our report is Just Another Day in Retail, and that comes straight out of one of the focus group participants' comments on, describing what it is. It's basically another day in retail. Okay. We asked them about, just describe for us, who's the typical person who you would see who undertakes this behaviour, who perpetrates this behaviour. And what came out was, again, a very gendered experience and a very gendered descriptions. And I think it's important, even though we're talking here about customers and what a big challenge that is in retail workplace contexts, that a lot of focus group participants were very keen to tell us that it's not only customers, and it's not only male customers, actually, that some talked about women perpetrating this behaviour as well. A lot of them talked about we can't lose sight of the fact that we have customer-perpetrated harassment, but then we also have very strong experiences of peers and supervisors or senior managers as well. And you can see that quote there, it's blokes from all sides, was kind of the way it was described. A lot of reflection on the power imbalance, that more managers in the top, and this creates a bit of an enabler of sexual harassment, but also very, very strong comments on the fact that it is highly gendered and a real age dimension to this as well. Okay, so we talked a lot about what some of the risky situations were and where people had experienced challenges. There's some very worrying and I would say scary experiences and traumatic experiences that were repeated in our focus groups about some of these risky situations. It's either working alone, working with very few colleagues or with no supervision, or at really understaffed times of the day. That might be at close, for example, or it might be at opening times. It could be late at night. It could be in different situations, such as taking out click and collect deliveries out to dark car parks with no supervision for very young women, for example. Intimate apparel, I've already talked about that. There are some areas that very strongly came out as being risky places. There was a lot of discussion in our focus groups about the ways in which the product, but also the way that the staff and the product were being managed by some of the supervisors that made employees feel that they were being sexualised in their work. So whether that was about the things that were being sold and the way that seemed to give customers in particular license to talk in a particular way to staff, or the way that managers sort of made employees act and look in a particular way, deport themselves in a particular way to sexualise them, to build up the connection with staff, and a lot of discussion again about that being a very gendered experience. All of these coloured blocks here are all quotes from our focus groups. I'll let you read those. So what does this mean for staff? We talked a lot about that. We know a lot of people who were victim survivors of sexual harassment talked about how it impacted on their well-being and their safety, about their wanting to go to work, and their withdrawal from both work and social life. You can see a quote there from Adeline, who talked about the very profound experience that she had and how it impacted on whether she wanted to actually go to work or whether she could go to work. And the sort of coping mechanisms that people use relate to some of these things: refusing certain types of shifts, moving into teams where they could remove themselves from someone or a group of people who were undertaking this sort of behaviour, moving into areas that were seen as less risky. So cosmetics kept coming up again and again as a problem area, moving to different areas. A lot of young women talked about adopting consciously a more what they call conservative image in terms of haircuts, in terms of makeup, in terms of the fit of clothing. And also a lot of people, and this is something that I think should be a big concern to retail employers, a lot of people talked about the way that they were planning on getting out of retail because they didn't want to put up with any more. This is just another day. There is a very poor understanding of organisational processes among the retail workforce. Sometimes this is about their lack of exposure to understanding, to being told or explained what the processes are. Sometimes it's about conflicting processes that are really in evidence in different retail organisations. For example, we found one policy in our key informant interviews and looking at doing policy analysis, that there were different processes depending on who the perpetrator was. So, for example, if it was a customer, or if it was a peer, or if it was a more senior person, there were different processes that staff had to follow. That they talked about how confusing that was. There's very low levels of confidence in organisational processes, and very low levels of trust that the advice that they receive internally would be accurate. And even managers told us about how confused they were about how they fitted in the reporting process. And the same went for people who were peers. I'm racing through this now. Okay. The process of actually getting to reporting and potentially making complaints, because we know that there is a very small minority of people who have the experience of sexual harassment at work actually make complaints. I would say that this will be much lower in retail than it is in many other contexts, and it's because of these reasons. People overwhelmingly were frightened because of what they saw as the real potential of losing shifts or losing their job if they made a complaint. People who did make complaints talked to us about how that had been downplayed or brushed off and not taken seriously. There was a couple of focus groups where people talked about actually making a complaint and quite ineffective and on the spot, what they call band-aid solutions being put in place. And I don't know whether anyone's ever heard of this, but I was quite shocked at this one, where one young woman in a focus group told us that it was customer harassment in particular was such a common experience that the employer in that particular case had set up a cry room, so that where staff went and reported that they'd had some abuse, harassment or something else happen in the workplace, they were told to go and have a cup of tea and a cry in the cry room. Clearly not an effective way to deal with staff in a trauma-informed way to have them have trust that their wellbeing is being looked out for. They also talked about there being lack of clear communication on what the potential outcomes of investigations might be, and a lack of support or any evidence of any trauma-informed approaches in dealing with complaints. Okay, so I might just finish on this, Mike, just so I don't take up all of the time. So, I talked about particular industry norms as something that we try to centre in our work. It came out absolutely clearly that this customer sovereignty, or the sort of credo that the customer is always right, is absolutely disciplining this behaviour. And in some ways, I would say it's shaping it and it's enabling this behaviour. Poor, bad customer behaviour is quite normalised by all of the stakeholders in retail, despite people being very concerned about it. So I'm not suggesting that people aren't concerned, but it is certainly something that's accepted. Sorry, I have to dance a bit to get my lights back on. something that's accepted by people across the sector. The narrative is quite fatalistic. This is too hard to control. What could we do? We're better to put, signs outside on the bus stop than it is to do something internally in the workplace. It's social norms. It's something that we can't control. Was absolutely the narrative here. And the managers that themselves in one-on-one conversations and in the targeted focus groups with supervisors and managers talked about how they themselves felt like they were at the mercy of customers and at the mercy of these kind of norms, and they didn't really know what to do. And also a lot of managers talked to us about, especially older women in retail are sort of 35 plus, talked about the enormous amount of labour that they put into trying to head off, identify and to head off harassment of their younger, particularly women staff, and the way that had become really very much a key part of their work, which was unpaid, unrecognised and under-supported by retail organisations. Training, we can come back to that. And then there's when Mike circulates these, we've got all of our findings, and then the recommendations that go against those findings are laid out there. They're basically 10 different findings that you can consult there, and I'm happy to have a conversation about that later. I'm sorry I took up too much time, Mike. Okay, that's it. I'm going to stop.
Never apologise for taking up time, Rae, with such important information and work. Thank you so much. What would be really great is if you could join us on the consultative panel for a case study that's coming up, and potentially that's a great way to channel some of those findings and recommendations into practical examples of what workplaces can do. Because I think that's the biggest question coming from me after hearing you speak is, given all that prevalence and the trickiness of dealing with customer-perpetrated harassment, what is it that workplaces can do to get through to those social norms and change the picture, change the story? So rather than open up for questions right now, what we might do is I'll hand to Alicia to introduce our next speaker, and we'll hopefully have more of a chance for discussion shortly.
Mike, and thank you so much, Professor Rae Cooper. I'm still reeling a little bit by the fact that organisations would actually set up a cry room as a response. Yeah, so much to unpack there around workplace culture and responses and prevention, but we will jump on.